I wanted to talk more about my article, but I think we should probably wrap it up just to kind of sum up the piece. It relates to this part of the conversation about is irrationality, disproportionate force, the indiscriminate use of weapons against civilians. Because when Israel was overwhelmed on October 7th, it had no response in its strategic arsenal other than disproportionate force, which happened to be directed against its own population. So in my piece, I use Hebrew language media testimonies of eyewitnesses to Israel's response on October 7th, as well as visual evidence of the supposed Hamas crimes, the most grisly crimes that are being presented by Israel on the international stage, to show that Israel may have killed large numbers of its own civilians, including non-combatants, in an effort to dislodge Hamas gunmen. And that's not to say that Hamas militants did not intentionally kill large numbers of Israelis, but they had small arms. They entered on foot and on motorcycles with Kalashnikovs. But what we saw in, for example, Kibboutz Be'eri, is every home was destroyed. They were destroyed with tank shells. And now we have admissions in Haaretz, only in Hebrew, that those houses were shelled in a deliberate military order, knowing that Israeli civilians were inside. And so then you see all these charred bodies, burned bodies in cars. You have Apache helicopter pilots saying, we were operating without any intelligence. We didn't know who was on the ground, but we had to fire everything we had. So you see all these photographs of cars that have completely been bombed out and the bodies inside are completely charred. Are we to believe that Hamas gunmen were able to meticulously burn every car and burn every home and somehow blow up these homes and reduce them to rubble and make them look like the damage we see in Gaza? So what we saw, Israel bombed its own base, its own military base at the Erez crossing. That's the biggest nerve center of the siege on Gaza. It was overwhelmed by Hamas militants and they bombed it with helicopters, with Hellfire missiles. And now the roof is off, the base is like mostly destroyed, and they had all their civil administrators inside. So now they're using these photos of charred bodies to say that Hamas burns people, that they rape people, and not to say that there were not atrocities committed by Hamas on October 7th. But it's amazing how the Israeli response on October 7th was so badly botched. There was so much friendly fire, and now they're using that to make way for more atrocities, senseless atrocities in Gaza, including the killing of Israeli captives, so the killing of more Israeli citizens. So this article, I think it needs to be translated into Hebrew. This needs to reach the Israeli public, the consciousness of the Israeli public. Anyone who can see right now what their military is doing and how little regard they have for Israeli life. They need to demand an independent investigation. And Netanyahu is saying, we're going to do that after the war. Don't talk about that, because he knows how sensitive it is. So it's so important to focus on that. And our own media hasn't touched this. It's a major story. It's one of the biggest stories of the war. Our own media hasn't touched it. Electronic Intifada did it. Mondo Weiss has touched it. We are on it. Our media won't touch it. So they need to engage with the fact that Israel's killed and is killing its own citizens senselessly.
And Max, just so that nobody twists what you're saying, because people will try to. I don't hear anything in what you've written. You acknowledge that obviously some Israeli civilians were killed by the militants, whether they were Hamas.
Well,
or some other
and I said that. I said that in the piece, and I just said that now. The point is, what were the weapons that we saw? I mean, Hamas recorded it. So first of all, they recorded themselves in Israeli military bases. There are close to 900 confirmed Israeli deaths, which is 500 less than the figure that we have been told since the beginning of 1400. If, Biden and his team want to challenge the Palestinian death toll, and two can play that game. The confirmed deaths are now at 900. Almost 50% of those deaths are uniformed Israeli soldiers who are actively engaged in the siege of Gaza and were combatants engaged in an act of war on October 7th.
And people can verify that themselves if they want to by going to Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper
Yes.
that has a poll, and that's where those figures are coming from.
Okay, so yes, exactly. So go see for yourself. So that's 50% of those deaths around. And then there are many armed Israelis, who people who were carrying guns in their homes. It's a very armed society. But the Hamas militants filmed much of that with GoPro cameras and with cell phones and put it online. And also GoPro cameras were recovered from dead Hamas militants and have been put online at like the Telegram account of South Responders, which is an Israeli rescue organization. And then they've been fed to the media as part of Israel's propaganda. And they do show them actually shooting some people with Kalashnikovs. And it is pretty clear that they were setting up checkpoints and shooting motorists who were passing by, escaping from the Nova Music Festival. But we don't see any evidence that they were able to burn every home in a kibbutz and reduce the homes to rubble, or burn all these bodies in cars. Those are the telltale signs of hellfire missiles and tank shells. And so that's what I'm saying. And that tactic may have caused heavy death tolls. Again, it's all to avoid the scenario of negotiation, in my view.
Yeah, and this QR code that the Israeli ambassador asked people to scan, right, to take people to evidence of that Israel had collected supposedly against Hamas. You were in your article, you talk about this, that the file online that goes to was actually some of the pieces of so-called evidence were deleted.
Yeah, Gilad Erdan has actually the UN ambassador who waived that QR code. As soon as he waived it, I went there. And first of all, the photos were questionable themselves. But second of all, they all disappeared. And now he's gone on Twitter and complained that they were all taken down because of complaints, because he's basically putting snuff films on a Google Drive and distributing it across the internet, basically like burned body parts. But as I pointed out, one of those photos that he was promoting as Hamas atrocities showed a pile of burned, comprehensively charred bodies in a dump truck. Okay, we saw video after video, and I linked to it in my article. I definitely am not showing it here, of Israelis defiling the corpses of Hamas activists and gunmen and everybody killed who came in from Gaza. Some of the people who came in were just onlookers. Defiling them in the most disgusting ways, stripping them, urinating on them, mutilating their body parts. Israelis who were killed that day were taken away in body bags individually to mortuaries and to forensic pathologists. So it's pretty obvious that the Israeli rescue crews or whoever arrived on the scene dumped dead Hamas militants in a dumpster after they were killed in either a tank strike or a Hellfire missile strike. They missed that. That was essentially defiling their bodies. They would have never done that to Jewish Israelis. So Gilad Erdan was promoting dead Hamas gunmen as evidence of Hamas atrocities, or to essentially say that they burned Israelis and put them in a dumpster to reinforce the point that Hamas is ISIS. And so that disappeared, and now he's saying it was just a glitch.
Yeah, and this follows, as you talk about a lot, this attempt to roll out this lie about 40 beheaded babies, right, which was spread around a lot, and then ultimately that was retracted. So there's ample grounds to be skeptical of everything that Israel has said, and your report at thegrayzone.com is trying to look at some of the available evidence that comes from, as far as I understand your story, it comes from Israeli sources.
100%, and you can just look at the visual evidence. And I also relied on documentation of my own in Gaza in 2014, where like a car of a taxi driver named Fadel Alawan, who was killed by a Hellfire missile strike from a drone after he dropped a wounded fighter off at a hospital without knowing it. He didn't, and they just killed him. So I got to look at his car in Gaza City. It looked just like the cars that you see in the Israeli propaganda that they're saying Hamas burned. And I actually remember looking in his car and seeing his sandal melted into the gas pedal. Only a Hellfire missile can do that and have that much precision. So I think there's another piece to be done, and it's about the source of the beheaded baby's claim. We nailed one of the sources, who happened to be an extremist settler who was a reservist who got to Kibbutz Be'eri and just fed this lie to a Israeli journalist. But there's another source behind so many of these claims, like, for example, that Hamas cut the fetus out of a woman. And it's one rescuer who's part of this rescue crew called Zaka. And basically everyone's just taking these people at their word without doing any examination. I think one day there will be an independent commission, and it will bear out a lot of the points that I'm making, that a lot of people on the Israeli left, the radical left in Israel, are making right now, and which a lot of the families of captives are quietly discussing, but which they're afraid to say in public. And it's, again, it's one of the biggest stories of the war, and the whole US and Western media won't touch it.
In the US, I've only seen, apart from the gray zone, there were stories earlier on in the electronic intifada and also Mondo Weiss to this effect. But otherwise, this aspect's been totally ignored.